This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Before this week's podcast, Auditing, Artificial Intelligence and Augmenting Pharmacist Options, an interview with former FDA Auditor Patrick Stone, Darshan will introduce this episode with a recap for the week of Thursday, July 23rd, 2020.
So this week was really interesting because there seems to have been two separate issues that have grabbed a lot of the headlines. The first seems to relate to the FDA's announcements. The second relates to clinical trials. So let's talk a little bit about FDA announcements. The most important one, from the perspective of what a lot of people were waiting for, is that the FDA just came out with a draft guidance on how to do cannabis-related clinical research. The cannabis community has consistently pointed out that the FDA seems to withhold research and discourage research. So the idea of putting out guidances on how to achieve that is furthers the FDA's position that it wants to encourage research as appropriate. Second announcement that I saw is the idea that the FDA is extending enforcement discretion for certain regenerative products or regenerative medicine products. So that should be kind of interesting as well, because regenerative medicine has gotten a lot of FDA issues, and while certain types of 361 and CTPs have not received attention, some have. So the FDA is continuing to extend its enforcement discretion. The other things to look at is the fact that the European Union is still putting out some more information, and the big question is, are companies ready for the clinical trial regulations that are coming out? In the context of transparency, the big one is the fact that there will be a central website that will allow for companies to talk a little bit about the type of clinical research they're doing, and that goes to the spirit of transparency. So this EU clinical trial portal and database will be a single central portal or platform for sponsors to submit applications and notifications, and is built to allow one-time submission across multiple European countries. So that should be interesting for a lot of companies. At the same time, there have been other interesting announcements. In the context of clinical research, people are starting to question whether in this era of diversity, why are patients diverse but clinical research primarily being done on white individuals? There is also some question about, the FDA also announced, for example, that they will resume domestic inspections, and foreign inspections probably will be soon thereafter. But outside that piece of clinical research, though, the other bit of information that did come out is that the US is accusing hackers of trying to steal coronavirus secrets for China. Recently, there was another allegation that Russia was doing something similar. So coronavirus is causing companies and countries to try to save lives. And while I think that is inherently a good thing, I'm not sure that stealing research is how you get to it. But maybe there needs to be a discussion about how do countries share data in the context of a pandemic. And if all these countries are trying to steal US data, the question then becomes, is US really paying for research in the beginning itself? So are other countries carrying their weight in other times? The other questions that keep coming up are just ways companies should consider doing research. Health tech companies are beginning to complain that while there are concerns around privacy or government surveillance, the fact that there wasn't a coordinated nationwide pandemic response shows that innovation is problematic in the healthcare industry. Now, inherently, that's not news, because I think that everyone knows that that progress is slow in the healthcare industry. But that's because you're talking about something extremely personal for individuals. And so it's important that health tech understand where these challenges are coming from. I see a lot of the questions being raised similar to what I've seen some of the PhD students say, which is if science comes first. And that's absolutely true, but while science is important, it's not the only criterion. For example, you have to consider what people's opinions on privacy might be. I just read a recent article saying that, I think it was the New York Times actually that came out and said that China is trying to catalog the DNA of all males in China to create a central depository and repository. The question is that if you're doing that, while there may be some significant value for research and for scientists in general, does that necessarily inhibit those individuals' rights. So something to consider. Similarly, tech companies have always used red teams, and having red and blue teams implies having a significant debate. And maybe there is a need of having scientists do something similar. This could be applicable in the context of healthcare and research, but also in the context of AI, i.e. artificial intelligence. So something else to keep in mind. If you think I missed anything that was newsworthy, if you think that there is something really interesting happening, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at DarshanTalks, or just feel free to reach out to me at darshan@conformlaw.com. I look forward to hearing from you.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have a very special guest for us. We have Patrick Stone, and Patrick is an author. Patrick is ex-FDA. Patrick is an auditor and a remediator who comes in and reviews facilities for a bunch of different types of facilities. But of recent note, he's been reviewing, auditing, and remediating drug companies, but he's obviously had experience with food companies before and device. Is that all accurate, Patrick? Did I miss anything?
No, that's very accurate. Thank you.
Of course. So Patrick, how have you been?
Well, I've been very busy and not traveling, which is not normal for me. In the past 9 years, I've typically gone on 5 international trips and every other week domestic travel. So, it's been a transition. It's been a good transition not having to travel because, when you end up somewhere at midnight and you have to get to work at 7 or 8, it's harder to be productive, as productive as you could be. Also saving some money on my client side.
Yeah.
They're reducing their costs and realizing that we should have been doing this for quite some time.
But now you talk about this idea of not traveling, and I've done a bunch of different interviews on this, but are you seeing this rise of remote monitoring? Everyone's been talking about centralized and remote monitoring. Is COVID going to be the reason we finally really switch over to that? Or is COVID going to come and go and we'll go back to being regular, if you will?
So much of the audits that I had scheduled for this year and all the way through December of 2020 have all transitioned from in-person to virtual or remote. And I do think that this will push the monitoring side to be more remote in nature. And it will also assist with auditing being virtual. Now, what we want to take a cue on is how is the FDA going to do it? Because my clients are expecting the most value added service. And if that includes having to go to the sites or having to go to their headquarters, then that's what we'll do. Because I'm not sure that FDA is going to go virtual. I think that's what everyone's waiting on, is to see, will FDA do a virtual audit or not? And I think the answer is still pending.
But that's an interesting question, right? So is the FDA's position on this really as relevant as it might have been? Because the FDA has taken the position that they want industry to go virtual. They want industry to look at centralized monitoring and saying that, you know what, we want you to look at a risk-based monitoring plan. We want you to evaluate from a centralized perspective where the signals actually are. And if all that is true, going on site, obviously it makes sense sometimes, and that there's absolutely value on that. But you're going to miss the larger signals because you're on site looking at a single individual site. So the FDA's perspective, they're really looking at problematic sites at that point, and probably already conducting a bunch of centralized review. I mean, if anything, an application review would be a type of centralized review in the end, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So I guess I'm sort of pontificating from some kind of soapbox, but what's your take? Do you think that the FDA's perspective changes things? What are the upsides and downsides, if you will, on going towards this centralized or remote monitoring process? And do you also look at centralized and remote as being the same thing here, or do you see them as two separate issues?
Well, they can be one and the same in the sense, because, you know, when you're dealing with the centralized paradigm, remote monitoring is part of that. Now, what I would say is FDA will probably take longer than industry to migrate to an all virtual or remote audit per se.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they will be doing more virtual audits from a international perspective. So we may be seeing more of this type of thing being done by FDA, but domestically, I think they're still going to try to get to the sites. And I think that sponsors will be the ones and with the help of sites, because remember, the stopgap to all of this centralized monitoring, remote monitoring, is access to the EMR, right?
Right.
Allowing access to monitors. Clinic sites don't want to allow even auditors access to their EMR. They want to run the EMR themselves. So usually, you know, that takes being on site or sharing a screen of some sort, you know, if we're going to do this remotely. But traditionally, that's been the stopgap. Now, when the sites finally realize, hey, we really do want to do remote, because it takes a lot of time out of our schedules to get ready for a personal audit or someone coming into our clinic. And I think COVID, what it's doing is, because clinics and hospitals are mandating no external visitors, no extraneous work, they're saying, you know, if you're a patient, you have to come alone. You can't come with anyone. So we're getting to this point where they really don't want you in there. And I think that is going to be part of the norm going forward. Unfortunately, you know, for a couple of years, we'll be keeping patients isolated until we have a good handle on preventative defenses, because we don't see a lot of preventative defense, because of what we're seeing now is an explosion in cases.
So you talk about this perspective of how sites really want to talk about sharing the EMR, if you will. And the question I land up with is, have you heard of information blocking in the Cures Act? Has that come across your table yet?
No, I haven't. That's something new to me.
Yeah. So essentially what it is it's under the Cures Act, they came out saying that you can't prevent systems from sharing information. It was really set up because these large EMRs were preventing other systems from sharing information. The question becomes, and the Cures Act basically says you can't block information from crossing these boundaries, because you want to sort of control your EMR and control patient data. The question that comes out of that is, if you cannot stop information from crossing like that, can you therefore prevent the FDA from saying, I want access to your EMR, you're required to give me access under the Cures Act and or under this prevention of information blocking? And therefore the FDA gets a back channel into the data, and therefore starts looking at these types of systems and starts looking at remote monitoring at a site level. Do you think that that's a direction that the FDA would pursue, or quite honestly, it's just not that's just not how the FDA works internally?
I think that it'll take time for them to get to that point, but what they will do is give guidance to sponsors or CROs to say that, you know, based on this legislation, you have to allow, if the plan calls for centralized remote monitoring, you have to allow for it. Yeah. And you have to work within those parameters. And if they use the law to their advantage, I think that we will see an explosion of virtual reviews, of monitors not going to sites every month or every other week like they've done traditionally. And you'll see them getting online and doing their monitoring remotely, which will be very efficient. And I think that it will cut costs for our drugs. I think that was the original intention of all of this going electronic, not just for storage, archiving, and backup system, but also to cut costs, because the costs are enormous. And where do you cut? You obviously don't want to cut corners to market, but you want to cut corners like this where you're spending money to travel people around that in other cases wouldn't have to. Now, we know that you don't have to do that. What COVID is doing is not changing the paradigm. It's showing us that the paradigm works, that it can be effective and it could be cost saving.
Which really, I mean, it's interesting. You talk about, so I have this perspective that industry is now finally moving towards patient centricity. And patient centricity to me means 4 basic components. It comes down to privacy. It comes down to transparency. It comes down to intellectual property, so the company itself can protect its own intellectual property. And then on the other hand, access. And to me, this type of information blocking, this type of, I can't share this information with you, goes to the transparency angle of this. Have you heard of the Blue Button program?
No, I haven't. But what I have seen is Europe does a lot better job at securing patient information, at keeping it secure.
Right.
And they do a better job at sharing things in a non-changeable manner, right? Because it's one thing to grant access, and it's another to ensure that in data integrity, right? That nothing will change or nothing can be changed while the review is happening.
100%. So I think you're right. A lot of what I'm talking about really started in Europe and is now being considered in some way in the US. So this Blue Button program I was talking about earlier, the way this came out is patients were, it's a Department of Defense thing that HHS has adopted. And essentially they're saying that we want patients to be able to access their own data. So if you're creating a new EMR, they're basically allowing for like a download button where you can download your own data. Question is, if patients participate in studies because they want to help the study itself, will they allow for the download of data and therefore the transmission of data, and therefore allow for someone like you to be able to remotely access this data and help other patients, which is the reason why they joined in the first place? Based on your interactions, do you see that being a feasible thing and or useful thing?
It's definitely feasible. As far as usefulness, I think that there should be a time period, right, where if you're in a blinded trial and if you migrate into an open label phase portion, sure. I think that's where you can allow for this downloading of data. But during certain aspects of a trial, depending on the way the trial is structured, I don't think that's 100% feasible from your first informed consent to your last. I think there will be issues where we have to keep things in a blinded manner, and allowing for some of this would inherently allow for unblinding, whether it's a data unblind or a treatment unblind. We don't want either one. So as long as it's done carefully and thoughtfully, it will be valuable, not just for the patient's records, that they can bring these records to them to the next time. Because I think what you see a lot is patients don't remember, what they did or what they were treated with, or, if something is long-term, 5 years, 6 years, it's hard to recall that. So having a jacket, having your file and the ability to provide that file to your next primary care person or your principal investigator is valuable to them because they get the record straight and they don't have to be looking for your records in the ether, right? They have to go searching for, this doctor and that doctor and this hospital system.
Yep.
I think the value is more in the portability of your file and the ability to not have those inclusion-exclusion violations that we see too often, or these waivers.
So talking a little bit further about patient centricity, about remote monitoring, in your experience now, I think of you as an expert in this area, and I've always thought about the fact that you've been in the trenches where you have battled investigators who won't show you documents, or individuals who would, but they didn't know what they were doing, or just were incompetent, or whatever it was. And then obviously the vast majority are good at what they do and are hoping to work as effectively as they can with the FDA, with sponsors. What are the upsides and downsides of switching over to remote monitoring?
Well, so the upside would be, monitors have a tough job and they have to wear many hats. And some of those hats will be diminished with virtual only. So there'll have to be a hybrid of on-site and virtual. And the plans would have to be a risk-based approach in that manner. But I would say the upside would be that, monitors have to look at almost 100% of primary and secondary data or data validation. They have to review those and show that, through data integrity, that the source matches the CRF or the data listings that are going to be sent. Right. So that upside is that they can do that more efficiently and truly be 100% without worrying about, what time does my plane leave? What time does the taxi get here? All of that stuff goes away. Right. Now, some of the hats that they wear are getting the sites in compliance, like steering them back onto the protocol and showing them that, hey, look, this is why you're having deviations or so many deviations. And some of that training may not be as effective, or they may not catch who exactly is doing the bulk of these deviations. Where are they coming from? So some of that being at the site will be diminished. If you're not at the site, there's certain cues or nonverbals, or just understanding how their clinic works. So that, I think, would be some of the downside, because remember, monitors have to not just look for compliance from the PI's perspective, but they have to look at enrollment, and they have to look at milestones, and there's a lot of other aspects to monitoring that are not necessarily in a plan, right? They're part of the monitor's regular daily duties of, I'm not just looking at these subjects that I haven't reviewed since last time. I'm looking at other areas. So those other areas will be a little more diminished if we just do remote.
So one of the things you didn't mention, but strikes me as interesting right now, is where people are losing jobs. Do you think that this type of changeover will result in monitors having to be retrained and or losing jobs? Or do you think this was already part of what you guys already did, and therefore it's not so much needing to be retrained as much as just more work coming up your way? And does this result in more employment opportunities, therefore?
Yeah, I think that, we're not going to see less monitors. No, unfortunately, we see too many unqualified monitors that maybe have, a non-scientific degrees, or, they took a few classes and now they think they're ready to monitor. I think we see too much of that. What we need to do is let sponsors understand the quality and the qualifications of a monitor, and help sponsors understand how pivotal monitors truly are to their project. And FDA focuses a lot on how much monitoring is done. Even the guidance tells you for QA oversight and monitoring, the more you have, the less your review cycle will be. And obviously that comes with the more quality oversight and QC monitoring you have will reduce your review cycle. It states it in the guidance itself. So monitors shouldn't necessarily worry about job security, because there's so many pipelines coming out that there will always be a need for monitors. And even if they become as efficient as they possibly can, conducting remote reviews, there will still be a need for an army of monitors. And this is just the way it's going to be. But again, we need sponsors to understand what qualifications are truly the most important and necessary for a monitor, and what's the disease state, and what is the product itself. Is it understandable? There's a lot of areas there that sometimes are missed on. We just need a body to go monitor. Well, that's hopefully that's not the thought process anymore.
So that's interesting. So what does the future quote unquote good monitor look like in your opinion? Let's say you're now a sponsor. You are now looking at a bunch of different CROs, and you have to figure out which CRO you're going to choose based on the types of monitors that they have. Who do you look for?
I would be the toughest QA person reviewing CVs. I really would, because I have seen the worst of monitors, and I've actually had to assist with closing down monitors in Texas, because they were hiring librarians, they were hiring basket weaving degrees and things of this nature, and it's like, wait a minute, do you have any scientific qualifications for yourself or your monitors? Do you have any scientific background? So I think one of my biggest parts would be, do they have at least a biology degree or some degree in science, chemistry, microbiology, whatever, some scientific discipline that you'll be dealing with. And then obviously there'll be have you ever worked with this class of drug or with this disease state? I would be wanting to see monitors that have 3 to 5 years experience in this class of drug or type of disease. For my taste, I would be looking for those physician assistants or nurses that either left for their own reasons or they wanted to transition into the clinical trial place. I would be looking for those type of credentials, because let's face it, monitors are not just connecting the dots, and they never have just connected the dots, right? I mean, they're not just scouring your data to see where you deviated. That's part of their purview, but a lot of it is, patient safety. Like, are you enrolling subjects with the correct histories, with documented data that shows they have this disease state and that they meet every inclusion and don't meet exclusion? So they're really special case employees. They're not QA, right? Because obviously QA, you want a higher understanding, but at the same time, they have to understand details that aren't written in a protocol or an investigator brochure.
So I'm going to challenge you a little bit, because I want to understand your thought process here. The guidance, if I remember correctly, also says having requisite experience, but you place a higher value in the degree. Tell me what your experience suggests and why that distinction matters to you.
Well, I mean, 3 to 5 years in the program area is still minimal experience, right? But if you set the bar too high, you'd never find the right fit or the monitor that you need. I place a high value on degree or background, because in many cases it's hard to translate a literature degree with understanding a gene therapy product, a plasmid, or some sort of new chemistry, right? In order for them to understand the protocol itself, they have to do homework. And I kind of would rather not have to have my monitors do homework to understand their job well. And experience counts for a lot. So if you have someone with a literature degree that has 10 years experience, hopefully they've gotten to a level where they do understand things, and maybe that could be a consideration for the monitoring. But at the same time, I really want that background, because the way I look at it is the way FDA hires individuals, because I was a part of the recruitment of FDA minorities.
Interesting.
And so, because FDA puts such a high background on science-based degrees, and Europe does too. If you look at the way EU hires their inspectors, they won't touch you unless you have 10 years experience in the field, right? Oh, yeah. And a lot of them are PhDs, they're MDs, they're PharmDs. So if you look at the quality of inspector from the EU, the caliber is much higher. So it's a lot harder to get in. But going back to the monitor part and the CVs and the expectations of background, I think it's important for monitors to have some scientific background. It seems like a big stretch to start off, your career as an English major and transition into biotechnology, drug development.
So let me. To me, this is fascinating. I'm gonna take a slight detour because you said something that fascinates me. In that you said that in Europe, the monitors tend to be pharmacists, have been pharmacists, and my experience in the U.S. is that, number one, pharmacists aren't as involved in clinical research at all. As a pharmacist, I know I get a bunch of people asking me, well, how do I get into clinical research? And I go, what would you do? Most of them land up gravitating towards being what's called medical affairs, or being in sometimes advertising, sometimes MSLs, but most don't go into clinical research. Why do you think Europe, and if your experience indicates the US, either doesn't have enough or has more, depending on which place you're looking at, pharmacists, and why does it matter?
So I was speaking more to the EMA or EU auditors, like the regulatory auditors, but there are but I have seen, when I go to Europe and Italy, France, I have seen MDs as monitors. I'm like, wait a minute, why are you monitoring? This is weird to me.
Right.
Like, do they pay you enough? I mean, because monitors tend to be on the middle scale or, lower scale, because they're the army. They're the ones where the rubber meets the road. So you wouldn't necessarily expect to get MD pay for monitor, but I do see it. And I think that when I've asked these monitors, like, wow, how did you make this transition? And they were like, well, I just, even pharmacists per se, they said, I didn't want to be behind a counter filling scripts anymore. I wanted to be in the innovation part, and this is where they started me out. Obviously, they move up the ladder fairly quickly. They become managers of monitor teams, or they become ClinOps, or like you said, regulatory. Now, regulatory is kind of a hard, because if you switch from pharmacy to regulatory, you're talking about legal aspects and submitting items, and it's a lot more complicated. But For the ClinOps and monitoring part, we do see this in Europe. Actually, one of my best friends is a PhD in neuroanatomy, and he's a monitor. Like, why? I don't know. He tried to get into FDA. They wanted to put him in imports, and he was like, "Wait a minute, I have a PhD. I'm not going to do imports. I want to be in domestics. I want to do the drug work and innovation." And they didn't hire him, and they were like, "Well, we have an opening for imports. You can transition to domestic later." But even in U.S., because we have so many degreed individuals, which is another reason why I would stick to scientifics, because we have a glut of biology majors out there that are washing cars, or they're painting, or they're not doing anything in their field. So they're there, they're available, they're out there. It's just a matter of finding those individuals that kind of gave up on their biology background. But EU is the same. There's a high demand for jobs, right, and qualified individuals. And I think the Europeans don't really see it as a downgrade, right? If they start as a monitor, or if they're a pharmacist and they transition to monitoring, they don't look at it the same way we would as, oh, that's a step down. Well, no, in their mind, it's not.